The dining room fell silent as my mother-in-law placed the last plate down. 23 steaks, 23 desserts, 24 people at the table. I sat there, the only one without food, watching my husband cut into his perfectly cooked ribeye while I had nothing but an empty plate and a glass of water. My mother-in-law smiled sweetly at everyone except me. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was calculated humiliation at what was supposed to be our family celebration dinner. But what she didn't know was that I had been documenting every single slight, every cruel comment, every deliberate exclusion for the past 2 years. And tonight, after this final insult, I was finally ready to show everyone exactly who she really was. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. I'm sitting here watching 23 people enjoy their perfectly cooked steaks while my plate remains completely empty, and honestly, I'm not even surprised anymore. The smell of garlic butter and rosemary fills the dining room, mixed with the sound of silverware clinking against china and satisfied murmurs about how delicious everything tastes. My mother-in-law Linda moves gracefully between the kitchen and dining room, checking on everyone's needs, refilling wine glasses, asking if anyone wants seconds on the roasted vegetables. She's the picture of a perfect hostess, smiling warmly at each family member, making sure cousin Sarah has extra mashed potatoes because she's pregnant, cutting up meat for little Tommy because his hands are still clumsy with a knife. Everyone is praising her cooking, talking about how lucky we all are to have such a wonderful matriarch who brings the family together with these incredible meals. My husband David is deep in conversation with his brother about work, occasionally pausing to compliment his mother's cooking between bites of his medium-rare steak. He hasn't even noticed that I'm the only person at this 24-person table without food. When I quietly mentioned it to him 5 minutes ago, he just shrugged and said, "Mom probably forgot to make an extra portion. Maybe I should ask her about it." But he said it while cutting another piece of steak, not even looking up from his plate. This isn't forgetfulness, though. This isn't an honest mistake or an oversight in planning. This is Linda's masterpiece of passive-aggressive warfare, and everyone else is either oblivious to it or choosing to pretend they don't see what's happening. I've been documenting her behavior for 2 years now, collecting evidence of every slight, every calculated exclusion, every moment designed to make me feel like an outsider in what's supposed to be my own family. Tonight was supposed to be different. She specifically invited me to this dinner, told David it would be a wonderful family gathering to celebrate his recent promotion, assured him that I would be well taken care of. I should have known better. I should have seen this coming. But even I didn't think she'd be bold enough to deliberately exclude me from dinner itself, to make me sit here hungry while everyone else enjoys a feast. She's watching me now from across the room, and when our eyes meet, she gives me that same sweet smile she's been perfecting for 2 years. The one that says she's done nothing wrong while simultaneously letting me know that this humiliation is entirely intentional. I should have seen the warning signs during our very first meeting 2 years ago, when David nervously brought me to Sunday dinner at his parents' house, fidgeting with his tie in the driveway, while assuring me that his family was going to absolutely love me. Linda opened the front door wearing a pristine white apron over an expensive cashmere sweater, her silver hair perfectly styled, her smile bright, but somehow never reaching her eyes, as she looked me up and down like she was appraising livestock at an auction. She hugged David first, holding him just a little too long while murmuring about how handsome he looked, then turned to me with that same practiced smile and extended her hand instead of offering a hug, commenting on how interesting my outfit was in a tone that made it clear she found nothing interesting about it in a positive way. During dinner, she peppered me with questions that seemed friendly on the surface but felt like tiny cuts, asking about my family's background with raised eyebrows when I mentioned my father worked construction, wondering aloud if my job in marketing was really stable enough for someone planning a future with her son, suggesting that my apartment in the city must be terribly expensive and small compared to what David was used to growing up in their sprawling suburban home. When I mentioned my college degree, she smiled and said how nice that I went to a state school, then immediately launched into a story about David's Ivy League education and how proud they were of his academic achievements, making sure to emphasize every scholarship and honor he'd received, while I sat there feeling smaller with each accomplishment she listed. She asked if I cooked much, and when I admitted I usually ordered takeout after long work days, she laughed and said she hoped David wouldn't starve once he moved in with me, because growing up he was so spoiled by home-cooked meals every single night. Every compliment came with a subtle barb, every question felt like a test I was failing, and when David walked me to my car that night, he was practically glowing, saying how much his mother had liked me, how she told him in the kitchen that I seemed very sweet, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd spent 3 hours systematically undermining my confidence and making it clear that I would never be good enough for her precious son. I drove home that night with a knot in my stomach, telling myself I was being overly sensitive, that first meetings were always awkward, that she probably just needed time to warm up to me. But deep down, I knew exactly what had happened at that dinner table, and it was only the beginning. The wedding planning started out innocently enough until Linda inserted herself into every single decision by declaring that the Henderson family had certain traditions that simply had to be honored, traditions that somehow always seemed to conflict with everything I actually wanted for my own wedding. She insisted on coming dress shopping with my mother and me, arriving at the bridal salon with a thick folder full of photos showing what she called appropriate wedding gowns, all of which looked like they belonged in a museum from the 1950s, with high necklines and long sleeves and absolutely no personality whatsoever. When I tried on a gorgeous strapless dress with delicate beading that made me feel like a princess, she pursed her lips and whispered loudly to the consultant that it was a bit revealing for a church ceremony. Wasn't it? And perhaps we could find something more suitable for a woman marrying into such a respected family. She had opinions about everything, from the flowers which she said should be white roses because that's what Henderson brides had carried for 4 generations, to the venue which absolutely had to be the country club, where David's father was a member because they'd hosted every significant Henderson family event for the past 30 years. When I suggested a beautiful garden venue that David and I had fallen in love with, she sighed dramatically and explained that it would be so difficult for the older relatives to navigate the uneven pathways, and besides, what would people think if we didn't use the family's traditional location, especially when they'd already reserved our date at the club and put down a non-refundable deposit without asking us? The guest list became another battlefield where she produced spreadsheets of Henderson family friends and business associates who simply had to be invited. People David hadn't seen in years but who had known him since he was a baby, while somehow finding reasons why many of my friends and extended family members wouldn't really fit in with the crowd they were expecting. She questioned whether my college roommates would feel comfortable at such an elegant affair, suggested that my cousins from out of state might not want to make the expensive trip anyway, and wondered if perhaps we should keep the celebration more intimate by focusing on the people who really mattered to our future together. Every conversation ended with her sighing and saying she just wanted everything to be perfect for David because he deserved the wedding of his dreams, which apparently had nothing whatsoever to do with what I dreamed about for the most important day of my life. And when I tried to talk to David about feeling steamrolled by his mother's involvement, he would just smile and say how lucky we were to have someone so experienced helping us plan everything. The wedding day itself unfolded like a carefully orchestrated disaster designed to look like a series of unfortunate accidents, with Linda pulling strings behind the scenes, while maintaining her image as the devoted mother of the groom who was just trying to help everything run smoothly. She arrived at the bridal suite 3 hours before the ceremony, with a team of her friends who immediately took over my getting ready space, rearranging my carefully planned timeline and insisting that the photographer capture more pictures of David's family than mine because they had flown in from farther away, and this might be their only chance for professional photos. When we discovered that the seating chart had been mysteriously revised overnight, my college friends found themselves relegated to a table in the back corner near the kitchen doors, while Linda's garden club cronies occupied the prime spots near the head table. And when I questioned the changes, she explained with wide, innocent eyes that there had been a miscommunication with the venue coordinator, and this was the best they could do on such short notice. Her mother of the groom's speech was a masterpiece of passive exclusion, spending 10 minutes rhapsodizing about David's childhood, his accomplishments, his bright future, and what a blessing he was to their family, while I merited exactly 1 sentence about how they were excited to welcome a new daughter into their home, delivered with the same enthusiasm someone might use to announce a dental appointment. The wine incident happened during dinner when she approached our table to congratulate us again, gesturing animatedly while holding a full glass of red wine that somehow slipped from her perfectly manicured fingers and splashed across the front of my dress, creating a dark stain right over my heart that no amount of club soda could remove. She gasped and apologized profusely, making such a scene about her clumsiness that everyone rushed to comfort her instead of helping me. And within minutes, she had transformed from the villain who ruined my dress into the tragic figure who felt terrible about her accident, receiving sympathy and reassurance from guests, while I stood there with wine dripping down my gown. The photographer somehow missed capturing the moment of impact, but got several shots of Linda dabbing at my dress with napkins, looking like the caring mother-in-law trying to fix her mistake. And later, when I was changing into my reception dress, she cornered me in the bridal suite to say how sorry she was and how she hoped this wouldn't cast a shadow over my special day, delivered with that same sweet smile that never quite reached her eyes and made me wonder if anything about that spill had been accidental at all. After the honeymoon ended and we settled into our new apartment just 15 minutes from Linda's house, I quickly learned that proximity was going to be my biggest nightmare as she began treating our home like her personal extension, showing up unannounced with spare keys David had given her for emergencies, letting herself in while we were at work to leave casseroles and rearrange our furniture in ways she deemed more appropriate for a proper married couple. I would come home from long days at the office to find my kitchen completely reorganized according to her system, with my spices alphabetized and my dishes moved to cabinets she considered more logical. And when I gently mentioned that I preferred my own organization method, she would laugh and say she was just trying to help me learn how to run an efficient household, since I obviously hadn't had much practice living on my own. She had opinions about everything from our decorating choices to our grocery shopping habits, commenting that our modern furniture looked awfully cold and impersonal compared to the warm traditional pieces she could help us find at estate sales, suggesting that perhaps I should learn to cook more substantial meals instead of relying on those processed foods that were probably full of chemicals and definitely not what David was used to eating. Her visits became more frequent and more intrusive as the weeks passed, arriving during my work-from-home days to check on how I was settling in, bringing cleaning supplies because she noticed our bathroom could use a deeper scrub, offering to show me the proper way to fold David's shirts since I was apparently doing it wrong and causing wrinkles. She would walk through our apartment, making mental notes, and then later share her observations with David, telling him how concerned she was that I seemed overwhelmed by basic household management, how she'd noticed I wasn't keeping up with the cleaning the way a wife should, how perhaps she should come by more often to help me establish better routines until I got the hang of married life. When I tried to establish boundaries by asking her to call before visiting, she looked genuinely hurt and said she thought we were family now, that she'd always had an open-door relationship with David, and she certainly didn't want to be the kind of mother-in-law who wasn't welcome in her son's home. Delivering this guilt trip with such wounded sincerity that David immediately reassured her she was always welcome any time, completely missing how her constant presence was making me feel like a guest in my own home rather than the woman who actually lived there. Holiday gatherings at the Henderson house became exercises in systematic exclusion, disguised as family tradition, with Linda masterfully orchestrating events that left me feeling like hired help rather than a beloved family member, starting with Thanksgiving when she cheerfully assigned me to kitchen duty, while everyone else relaxed in the living room watching football and catching up on family news. While David's female cousins and his sister lounged on the couch with glasses of wine, chatting and laughing about childhood memories and inside jokes I could never understand, I found myself elbow-deep in soapy water scrubbing pots and pans, with Linda occasionally popping in to suggest I use more elbow grease on the roasting pan, or pointing out spots I had missed on the serving platters. Christmas morning brought its own special humiliation when I opened my carefully wrapped gift from Linda to find a clearly regifted candle still bearing the faint outline of a removed price sticker, while David unwrapped an expensive watch and everyone else received thoughtful, personalized presents that showed she had actually put time and consideration into their selections. The photo sessions were perhaps the cruelest cuts of all, with Linda directing elaborate family portraits that somehow always managed to exclude me either completely or position me at the very edge where I could easily be cropped out later. And when I tried to suggest we take some pictures that included everyone, she would smile and say, "Of course we would get to those in just a minute." But first she wanted to capture the core family members, since these photos would become treasured heirlooms someday. During Easter dinner, she assigned me to serve everyone else while the rest of the family remained seated, explaining that since I was the newest family member, it would be a wonderful way for me to show my appreciation for being welcomed into their traditions. And when I finally sat down to eat my own meal, The conversation had moved on to topics and people I knew nothing about, leaving me sitting in silence while everyone else laughed and shared stories. The pattern became so predictable that I started dreading invitations to family events, knowing I would spend the entire time feeling like an outsider looking in. Watching a close-knit family that had no real interest in making room for me, beyond the basic courtesy they would show any stranger, David happened to bring along. And when I tried to talk to my husband about how isolated these gatherings made me feel, he would dismiss my concerns by saying his family just took time to warm up to new people, and I should be patient because they really did care about me even if they had trouble showing it. Linda's assault on my professional life was perhaps her most insidious campaign, systematically undermining my career achievements, while positioning herself as simply a concerned mother-in-law who worried about the toll my ambitious work schedule was taking on my marriage and my health. When I received a major promotion that came with a significant salary increase and more responsibilities, she responded with a tight smile and immediate concern about how the extra stress might affect my ability to focus on building a strong foundation for my marriage, suggesting that perhaps this wasn't the right time in my life to be taking on such demanding commitments when I should be concentrating on supporting David and maybe starting a family soon. At social gatherings with David's colleagues and their wives, she would make seemingly innocent comments about how hard it must be for modern women to balance everything, how she worried about young couples who prioritized career advancement over spending quality time together, and how grateful she was that she had been able to focus on being a devoted wife and mother when David was growing up, instead of being distracted by outside obligations. These conversations inevitably led to awkward questions about my work schedule, whether I really needed to travel so much for business, and sympathetic looks directed toward David as if he was some kind of neglected husband suffering because his wife cared more about her job than her home life. She had a particular talent for planting seeds of doubt in David's mind during their private conversations, expressing concern that I seemed tired all the time lately, wondering if my boss was taking advantage of my dedication by giving me too much work, suggesting that maybe I should consider scaling back before I burned out completely and damaged my health or our relationship. When I won a prestigious industry award that should have been a moment of celebration, she managed to turn it into another source of worry by questioning whether the recognition was worth the long hours I had been putting in, whether the stress of maintaining such high performance standards was sustainable, and whether David felt supported in his own career goals or if he was making sacrifices to accommodate my demanding schedule. Her campaign was so subtle and consistent that even David began asking whether I really needed to work so late, whether certain business trips were absolutely necessary, and whether I had considered looking for a position with better work-life balance. Completely unaware that these concerns were being carefully cultivated by his mother's constant commentary about my supposedly unhealthy relationship with my career and my apparent inability to properly prioritize my marriage. When we finally announced my pregnancy at Sunday dinner, I expected tears of joy and excited congratulations. But instead, Linda's face went completely blank for several long seconds before she forced a smile and said how wonderful that was, though her tone suggested she had just been informed about a mildly inconvenient scheduling conflict, rather than the arrival of her first grandchild. While David beamed and accepted hugs and backslaps from his father and brother, Linda's response was notably restrained, asking immediately about my due date and whether I had found a good doctor yet, then launching into a lecture about the importance of proper prenatal care and nutrition, as if I were some teenager who had stumbled accidentally into motherhood rather than a married woman in her 20s who had been trying to conceive for months. Within days of our announcement, she had completely taken over every aspect of pregnancy planning, researching pediatricians in our area and making appointments without consulting me, purchasing pregnancy books and leaving them on our kitchen counter with particular chapters highlighted in yellow marker, and calling me daily to check on my symptoms and offer advice about everything from which vitamins I should be taking to how much weight gain was appropriate for someone of my build. The baby immediately became her grandchild in every conversation, with Linda talking about her plans for the nursery she would set up at her house, the college fund she was going to start, and the family traditions she was excited to pass down to her grandchild, while I sat there feeling like little more than a vessel carrying her genetic legacy rather than an expectant mother with my own hopes and dreams for my child. She insisted on accompanying me to doctor appointments despite my protests. taking notes during consultations and asking detailed questions about my medical history that made me feel like she was conducting her own independent assessment of my fitness as an incubator for her precious grandchild. When we mentioned we were thinking about names, she immediately produced lists of Henderson family names that should be considered, explaining the significance of each one and making it clear that choosing something outside the family tradition would be a disappointing rejection of their heritage. Her excitement seemed entirely focused on the baby as an extension of David and herself, with virtually no acknowledgement that I was anything more than the unfortunate necessity required for this grandchild to exist. And when I tried to express my own feelings about becoming a mother, she would nod politely and then redirect the conversation back to her own plans and expectations for how this pregnancy should proceed. The baby shower Linda threw for me was actually thrown for herself, planned entirely without my input, despite my repeated attempts to discuss guest lists and themes, with invitations sent to her friends and acquaintances rather than the people I actually wanted to celebrate with, resulting in a room full of women I barely knew sitting around discussing my pregnancy like I was an interesting science experiment rather than the guest of honor. She had chosen a venue without asking me, decorated according to her own taste in pastels and vintage themes that couldn't have been further from my personal style, and created a menu of finger foods and tea service that felt more like one of her garden club meetings than a celebration for an expectant mother in her 20s. When I arrived at what was supposed to be my own party, I discovered that many of my closest friends hadn't been invited at all, while Linda had filled the guest list with women from her church, neighbors I had met maybe twice, and David's elderly aunts who spent the entire afternoon comparing my pregnancy to their own experiences from decades ago and offering unsolicited advice about everything from breastfeeding to sleep training. The gift opening ceremony became Linda's personal showcase as she positioned herself right next to my chair, reaching for each present before I could even touch it, exclaiming over how thoughtful each gift was, while somehow managing to thank people on my behalf and taking credit for having such wonderful friends who clearly understood exactly what the baby would need. She opened cards and read them aloud in a voice that suggested she was the one receiving these good wishes, organized the gifts according to her own system while I sat there feeling like a spectator at my own shower, and took extensive photos of herself holding up each present as if she were the proud recipient rather than just the overbearing grandmother-to-be. When someone complimented the beautiful decorations or delicious refreshments, Linda glowed with pride and launched into detailed explanations of how much thought she had put into every element, how she had wanted everything to be perfect for her daughter-in-law, completely ignoring the fact that none of these choices reflected my preferences or personality in any way. The whole afternoon felt surreal, sitting in a room full of strangers celebrating a pregnancy that Linda had somehow made entirely about herself, watching her accept congratulations and praise for throwing such a lovely party, while I smiled politely and pretended to be grateful for this bizarre performance of grandmother devotion that had nothing whatsoever to do with actually honoring me or my journey into motherhood. The postpartum period became a nightmare of constant supervision and criticism as Linda moved into our guest room under the guise of helping with the baby, but instead spent every waking moment scrutinizing my every move as a new mother and finding endless ways to demonstrate that I was doing everything wrong while she obviously knew better. She would hover over me during feeding times, clicking her tongue when I struggled with breastfeeding, and immediately offering to take the baby so he could get a proper bottle instead of continuing to fuss with my obvious inadequacy, then spending the next hour explaining the correct way to hold him, burp him, and soothe him back to sleep, while I sat there feeling utterly useless in my own living room. Every cry from the baby brought Linda rushing in to assess the situation, pushing past me to pick him up while explaining that I clearly hadn't learned to distinguish between his different types of cries yet, that this was obviously hunger or tiredness or overstimulation, and perhaps if I paid closer attention, I would start to understand what he was trying to communicate instead of just looking overwhelmed all the time. She reorganized our entire nursery according to her superior knowledge of infant care, moving the changing supplies to more logical locations, rearranging the closet so the clothes were properly organized by size and season, and installing additional safety measures that she assured me were absolutely necessary, since first-time mothers often overlooked obvious hazards that could endanger their babies. When friends came to visit and meet the baby, Linda would intercept them at the door and spend 20 minutes sharing her own observations about the baby's development, his feeding schedule, and his sleeping patterns, positioning herself as the primary caregiver, while I remained in the background looking tired and disheveled. Watching this woman present herself as the competent grandmother who was thankfully available to help her struggling daughter-in-law manage this overwhelming responsibility. She criticized everything from my recovery timeline, suggesting I should be feeling more energetic by now, and maybe I wasn't taking the right vitamins, to my emotional state, wondering if perhaps I should talk to someone about what seemed like more than normal postpartum blues, always phrasing her concerns in ways that made David worry about my mental health rather than question his mother's invasive behavior. By the end of her 2-week stay, I felt completely incompetent as a mother, doubting my every instinct and convinced that my own baby preferred his grandmother to me, which was exactly the dynamic Linda had been working to create from the moment she walked through our door. After months of gaslighting and being told I was overreacting or being too sensitive whenever I tried to explain Linda's behavior to David, I finally decided to start documenting everything methodically, beginning with screenshots of text messages, where she would send sweet public messages to the family group chat, while sending me private messages with subtle digs about my housekeeping or parenting choices. I started taking photos of the passive-aggressive notes she would leave around our house during her visits, like the one stuck to our refrigerator suggesting better meal planning for the baby's nutritional needs, or the article about postpartum depression she left on my nightstand with certain paragraphs highlighted, always with plausible deniability built in so she could claim she was just trying to be helpful if confronted. My phone became a secret weapon as I learned to discreetly record conversations where she would make cutting remarks about my abilities as a wife and mother, capturing her tone and exact words, so I would have proof of the condescending way she spoke to me when David wasn't around to witness it. I documented every family gathering where I was excluded from photos, every holiday where I was assigned cleanup duty while others relaxed, every time she interrupted me mid-sentence to correct something I had said about my own child or my own experiences, creating a comprehensive timeline of deliberate slights that painted a clear picture of systematic exclusion and emotional abuse. The evidence folder on my phone grew larger each week, as I screenshot social media posts where she would gush about David and the baby without mentioning me at all, saved voicemails where she would call to check on the baby's well-being without asking how I was doing, and photographed the gifts she brought for David and the baby while consistently arriving empty-handed for me, even on special occasions like my birthday or Mother's Day. I started writing detailed notes immediately after each interaction, recording not just what she said but how she said it, who was present, and how David reacted or failed to react when his mother undermined me in front of him, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss as paranoia or oversensitivity. The documentation process became almost therapeutic, validating my experiences and proving to myself that I wasn't imagining the calculated cruelty behind her sweet grandmother facade, and I began to realize that having concrete evidence might be the only way to make David see what had been happening right in front of him for the past 2 years. The discovery of the secret Henderson family group chat happened completely by accident when David left his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter and a notification popped up from something called Henderson Family Updates, a chat I had never heard of despite being married into this family for over a year and supposedly being considered one of them now. My heart pounded as I opened the conversation thread and scrolled back through months of messages, finding a parallel universe where Linda led discussions about my shortcomings with gleeful participation from David's siblings and extended family members who I thought had been friendly and welcoming to my face. Linda's messages were the most frequent and the most vicious, sharing observations about my parenting skills with crying, laughing emojis, posting photos of our messy living room with captions about how some people just weren't raised to maintain proper homes, and making jokes about my cooking that had everyone responding with their own stories about the terrible meals I had served when they visited. She had turned me into entertainment for the entire family, sharing details about my postpartum struggles, my work schedule, and my relationship with David that should have been private, transforming intimate family moments into content for their group mockery sessions. The most devastating messages were the ones where she discussed upcoming family events and actively strategized about how to minimize my involvement, suggesting seating arrangements that would keep me away from interesting conversations, discussing which activities I should be assigned to keep me busy and out of the way, and sharing gleeful updates about successful slights like the wine spill at my wedding or the empty plate at tonight's dinner. David's siblings chimed in with their own observations and suggestions, apparently viewing me as an outsider who needed to be tolerated rather than embraced, while his cousins shared stories about their own experiences with family members they wished would just disappear, making it clear that I was the current target of their collective disdain. Reading months of these conversations felt like being punched in the stomach repeatedly, seeing evidence that every family gathering had been preceded by planning sessions about how to exclude and humiliate me, that every smile and hug had been performed while they privately discussed my failures and inadequacies, and that David's own family had been actively working against my integration into their group while he remained completely oblivious to their campaign. The most recent messages in the chat were about tonight's dinner, with Linda describing her plan to serve everyone except me, and multiple family members expressing excitement about finally teaching me my place in their hierarchy, making it crystal clear that this evening's humiliation was not only deliberate, but had been eagerly anticipated by people I had considered friends. The unexpected ally came from the last person I thought would ever stand up for me when David's youngest sister Sarah knocked on my door 3 days after the disastrous family dinner, holding her own phone with tears in her eyes and an expression of genuine shame that I had never seen from any Henderson family member before. She had been scrolling through the family group chat when she suddenly realized how cruel and coordinated their treatment of me had become, she said, explaining that she had always participated in the conversations without really thinking about how devastating they would be for me to read, assuming it was just harmless family gossip rather than systematic emotional abuse orchestrated by their mother. Sarah confessed that she had been feeling increasingly uncomfortable with Linda's behavior over the past few months, especially after witnessing how I was excluded from the dinner while everyone else pretended nothing unusual was happening, and she couldn't sleep, knowing that she had been complicit in treating me like an enemy instead of welcoming me as her brother's wife and the mother of her nephew. She showed me additional screenshots from private conversations where Linda had been even more vicious, calling me names that were too harsh to repeat, and making predictions about how long my marriage would last once David finally realized what a burden I was to the family. Messages that made Sarah sick to her stomach when she read them with fresh eyes and understood their true malicious intent. From that day forward, Sarah became my secret informant and evidence collector, forwarding me screenshots of family planning sessions where Linda would strategize about upcoming events and how to minimize my participation, warning me in advance when special gatherings were being planned without my knowledge, and helping me document the ongoing pattern of exclusion that had become so normalized within their family that most members didn't even recognize it as abuse anymore. She started paying closer attention during family gatherings, taking her own photos and videos of moments when I was being ignored or mistreated, positioning herself as a witness who could corroborate my experiences and provide testimony that couldn't be dismissed as oversensitivity or paranoia from an outsider who didn't understand their family dynamics. Sarah's support gave me the validation I desperately needed, and the additional evidence that would make my case absolutely undeniable, but more importantly, she helped me realize that not everyone in David's family was actively working against me, that at least one person was willing to acknowledge the truth and stand up for what was right, even when it meant confronting their own mother's toxic behavior and risking their own position within the family hierarchy. David's brother Michael's wedding became the ultimate showcase of Linda's ability to orchestrate my humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability, starting with the family photo session where she directed the photographer through elaborate arrangements that somehow never included me despite my being married to one of the key family members for over 2 years now. She organized photos of the core Henderson family, then the extended Henderson relatives, then the childhood friends who were practically family, then the college roommates who had become like brothers, creating endless combinations that excluded me while she smiled and explained to the photographer that we needed to capture all the important relationships before we moved on to the more casual shots that might include everyone else. When I finally asked when we would be taking photos that included the spouses, Linda looked genuinely surprised and said of course we would get to those eventually. But first she wanted to make sure they had all the traditional family portraits that would become heilages. And wouldn't I understand how important it was to preserve these special moments for future generations of Henderson children? During the cocktail hour, I found myself assigned to coat duty, standing in a side room organizing guests' jackets and purses while everyone else mingled and caught up on family news. A job that Linda explained was perfect for me since I knew most people there and would be so helpful in making sure everyone's belongings stayed safe and organized throughout the evening. David was completely absorbed in his role as best man, giving speeches and posing for photos and catching up with old friends, occasionally waving at me from across the room, but never noticing that I was stuck in coat check duty, while his female cousins and sister-in-law were free to enjoy the celebration as actual wedding guests rather than unpaid. Staff members. When I tried to join conversations during the brief moments I could step away from my assigned post, Linda would somehow materialize to redirect me back to my duties, explaining that several guests had mentioned looking for their items, and she was sure I wouldn't want anyone to think the Henderson family didn't take proper care of their visitors' belongings. The evening reached its peak of absurdity when the photographer gathered everyone for the traditional family wedding shots, and Linda positioned herself as the coordinator, arranging people by importance and relationship to the couple, while somehow managing to place me behind a tall uncle where I was completely obscured, then suggesting that perhaps the professional photos should focus on the people who would really matter to Michael and his new wife in 20 years when they looked back at these pictures. David stood there beaming and following his mother's directions without question, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife had been systematically excluded from every meaningful moment of his brother's wedding. And when I later tried to explain how hurt I felt by the evening's treatment, he brushed off my concerns by saying weddings were always chaotic, and I was probably reading too much into innocent organizational decisions. The invitation to tonight's family dinner came with Linda's most convincing performance yet, calling me personally instead of just telling David about the gathering, her voice dripping with warmth as she explained that this celebration of his recent promotion needed to include the whole family, especially the woman who had supported him through all those long work nights and stressful projects. She insisted that I had been working so hard lately and deserved to be pampered for once, promising that I wouldn't have to lift a finger all evening, that she would take care of absolutely everything so I could just relax and enjoy being celebrated alongside my successful husband. Her tone so sincere that for a brief moment I almost believed she was finally ready to treat me like a real member of the family. When I hesitated, remembering all the previous disasters disguised as family bonding opportunities, she seemed to sense my reluctance and doubled down on her assurances, telling me how much she regretted that I sometimes felt left out at family gatherings, and how tonight would be different because she had planned everything specifically with me in mind, even asking about my dietary preferences, and promising that there would be plenty of food that I would absolutely love. The phone call lasted nearly 30 minutes as she painted a picture of the perfect family evening, complete with David's favorite meal, a beautiful table setting, and plenty of time for everyone to hear about his promotion and acknowledge how lucky he was to have such a supportive wife by his side, making me feel guilty for even questioning her motives when she was clearly putting so much effort into making this a special night for both of us. But as the day of the dinner approached, I found myself filled with growing dread rather than excitement. My documentation of Linda's previous behavior, creating a pattern that made this sudden change in attitude seem not like growth or genuine affection, but like the setup for her most elaborate humiliation yet. Sarah had been unusually quiet in our private messages, responding to my texts with short answers that made me wonder if she knew something about tonight's plans that she wasn't sharing. And when I asked David if he had any details about what his mother was planning, he just shrugged and said she seemed really excited about the whole thing, which should have been reassuring, but instead made my stomach twist with anxiety. I spent the entire day before the dinner with a growing certainty that Linda's promises about taking care of me were exactly the kind of careful word choice she specialized in, where being taken care of could mean being handled, managed, or dealt with rather than being honored and celebrated. And as I got dressed for what was supposed to be my husband's triumph, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was preparing for my own execution. So here I am, back in this moment of perfect humiliation that Linda orchestrated so beautifully, watching 23 people enjoy their perfectly cooked steaks while I sit with an empty plate and a growing rage that feels like it might actually set the dining room on fire if I don't find a way to channel it productively. The conversation flows around me as if I'm invisible, with family members praising Linda's cooking and discussing David's promotion while I remain the elephant in the room that everyone is expertly ignoring. Their practiced avoidance so smooth that I almost have to admire the coordination it must have taken to teach an entire extended family how to pretend they don't notice when someone is being systematically excluded from a meal. When David finally looks up from his plate and notices my obvious distress, his response is exactly the weak, ineffective defense I've come to expect from him over the past 2 years. A half-hearted suggestion that maybe there was a misunderstanding with the food count, delivered in a tone that makes it clear he's more concerned about not making waves than actually addressing the deliberate insult his mother has served me, along with everyone else's dinner. Linda immediately jumps in with her perfectly practiced expression of horror and concern, gasping about how she must have miscounted when she was planning the meal, how she feels absolutely terrible about this oversight, but her eyes are bright with satisfaction as she delivers this performance. And I can see the barely concealed smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she watches me struggle to maintain my composure in front of the entire Henderson family. The other family members murmur sympathetic sounds and offer to share their food, but their gestures feel hollow and performative, like they're going through the motions of politeness while secretly enjoying this spectacle that Linda has created for their entertainment. And I realize that this moment was probably discussed and anticipated in their group chat, just like every other humiliation I've endured at these family gatherings. David's weak attempt at defending me dies out quickly as Linda continues her Oscar-worthy performance of the mortified hostess who would never intentionally exclude anyone, especially not her beloved daughter-in-law. And he actually seems to be buying this act despite having witnessed 2 years of increasingly obvious mistreatment that should have made tonight's deliberate exclusion completely predictable. I can feel Linda's eyes on me as I sit here trying to decide how to respond, her smug satisfaction radiating across the table like heat from a fire, and I know that she's waiting for me to either break down in tears or storm out in anger, either reaction giving her exactly the dramatic scene she's been hoping for to cement my reputation as an unstable, oversensitive outsider who can't handle normal family dynamics. I pull my phone out of my purse with steady hands, my voice cutting through the dinner conversation like a knife, as I announce that since we're all family here, I thought this would be the perfect time to share something that really brings us together. And I can see Linda's face start to change as I swipe to the screen mirroring app I downloaded last week, specifically for this moment. The room falls completely silent as I connect to their smart TV, and suddenly the Henderson Family Updates group chat fills the entire dining room wall in glorious high definition. Months of their private conversations about me displayed for everyone to see, including tonight's planning session where Linda described her excitement about finally putting me in my place with the empty plate strategy. Gasps echo around the table as family members see their own names attached to messages mocking my cooking, criticizing my parenting, and planning ways to exclude me from gatherings, their faces transforming from confusion to horror as they realize their private cruelty is now on public display in front of everyone, including their children and spouses who weren't part of their toxic group chat. Linda's face has gone completely white, except for 2 bright red spots on her cheeks, her mouth opening and closing like a fish as she watches me scroll slowly through her most vicious messages, including the ones where she called me names I won't repeat and made bets about how long my marriage would last once David came to his senses. I read aloud some of the highlights in a steady, clear voice that carries perfectly in the shocked silence, starting with her messages about tonight's dinner, where she wrote that she was so excited to finally teach that little gold digger her place in this family, followed by enthusiastic responses from several people currently sitting at this table who are now staring at their plates like they might disappear into them. David's face cycles through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as he sees message after message from his beloved mother describing his wife as a burden, a mistake, and an outsider who needed to be put in her place, while his siblings and cousins who have been smiling at me for 2 years had been privately discussing my failures and shortcomings like I was some kind of entertainment for their group chat. The children at the kids' table are asking their parents what's happening, while the adults sit frozen in mortification, watching their carefully hidden cruelty exposed in real time. And I can see several people frantically reaching for their own phones to check if they can somehow delete their participation in this group chat that has now become evidence of a coordinated campaign of emotional abuse disguised as family bonding. Linda finally finds her voice and starts sputtering about context and misunderstandings, but her words sound hollow and desperate echoing in a room where everyone can see exactly what context these messages were written in. And her attempts to explain away 2 years of documented malice are falling flat in front of an audience that includes her own grandchildren, who are old enough to understand that Grandma has been saying very mean things about Aunt whoever I am to them. I stand up slowly, my voice gaining strength as I begin reading Linda's messages aloud to the horrified room, starting with her text from 3 days ago, where she wrote that she couldn't wait to see my face when I realized there was no food for me tonight, followed by laughing emojis and responses from David's sister and 2 cousins saying they wished they could be flies on the wall to watch my reaction. The silence is deafening as I continue scrolling and reading, sharing her message about how she deliberately spilled wine on my wedding dress and how proud she was that she managed to make it look like an accident while ruining my special day, a confession that makes several people gasp audibly and turn to stare at Linda with expressions of absolute disgust. I read her detailed analysis of my postpartum depression, where she wrote that she hoped the stress would be enough to make me leave David on my own so she wouldn't have to work so hard to get rid of me, followed by her celebration when I seemed to be struggling with breastfeeding, because it proved I wasn't cut out for motherhood the way Henderson women were supposed to be. Family members who I thought were friendly acquaintances are seeing their own names attached to cruel observations about my appearance, my housekeeping, my cooking, and my ability as a mother, their faces flushing with shame, as they realize their private mockery is being broadcast to spouses and children who had no idea they were capable of such calculated cruelty towards someone who had done nothing but try to fit into this family. Linda keeps trying to interrupt with explanations about how things sound worse out of context, but I continue reading her message about deliberately excluding me from family photos because she didn't want me in pictures that would become family erlages, her complaint that I was taking too long to get the hint that I wasn't really welcome, and her frustration that David was too blind to see what a burden his wife was on the whole family. The most devastating messages are the recent ones where she coordinated tonight's humiliation with military precision, discussing how she would serve everyone except me, and how satisfying it would be to watch me sit there hungry while everyone else enjoyed their meal, with multiple family members expressing excitement about finally putting me in my place and teaching me where I really stood in their hierarchy. David's face has gone completely pale as he reads along with everyone else, seeing his mother's true feelings about his wife spelled out in black and white, including her prediction that once he realized how much happier he could be without me dragging him down, he would thank her for helping him see the truth about his mistake of a marriage. Uncle Robert's wife starts crying as she sees messages making fun of my clothes and appearance, while David's teenage nephew looks horrified as he reads his grandmother's cruel commentary about his new aunt, and even Linda's closest allies in the family are staring at her with expressions of shock and disappointment as they realize the extent of her calculated campaign against me. The room erupts into chaos as Linda's carefully constructed facade crumbles before everyone's eyes, with David's father standing up so abruptly his chair falls backward, his face red with fury as he demands to know how his wife could have treated our family's newest member with such calculated cruelty for 2 entire years without him noticing. David's siblings start talking over each other, some trying to distance themselves from the group chat messages by claiming they never really meant what they wrote, others directing their anger at Linda for orchestrating this whole campaign and making them complicit in behavior they're now ashamed to have their own children witness. Sarah stands up and walks over to put her arm around me, loudly announcing to the room that she's been helping me document this abuse for weeks because she was disgusted by what their family had become under their mother's influence, and she's proud that I finally found the courage to expose the truth instead of suffering in silence like Linda wanted me to do. David looks like he's been hit by a truck as he stares at his phone screen, scrolling through months of messages he never knew existed, seeing his beloved mother's true feelings about his wife and his marriage spelled out in vicious detail. And when he finally speaks, his voice is shaking as he asks how long this has been going on and why no one ever told him what was happening right in front of him. Linda immediately switches into full victim mode, tears streaming down her face as she insists that everyone is taking those messages completely out of context, that she loves me like a daughter and was only trying to help me fit into the family better, that sometimes her concern came across wrong in text messages, but her heart was always in the right place. Her desperate backpedaling becomes increasingly frantic as family members continue reading the evidence on the wall, with her claiming that the wine spill was truly an accident, that the dinner oversight tonight was an honest mistake, that the photo exclusions were just poor planning, each excuse sounding more ridiculous as people see the documented proof of her deliberate malice displayed in high definition. David's grandmother, Linda's own mother-in-law, speaks up from her corner seat with a voice full of disgust, saying that she's never been more ashamed of anyone in her family and that this kind of behavior toward a young mother is absolutely unforgivable, effectively cutting off Linda's support from the family matriarch whose approval she's always craved. The children at the kids' table are asking their parents why Grandma was being so mean about me, forcing the adults to confront how their participation in this group chat appears through innocent eyes, and several people start apologizing to me directly, while others gather their belongings and announce they're leaving because they can't stay in the same room with someone who could orchestrate such sustained emotional abuse. David finally stands up and walks over to me, his eyes filled with tears as he takes my hands and says he's sorry, that he should have seen what was happening, that he's been a terrible husband for letting his mother treat me this way, and that he understands if I can't forgive him for being so blind to the pain I've been enduring while he made excuses for behavior that was inexcusable from the very beginning. 6 months later, I'm sitting at a very different kind of family dinner where Linda serves everyone equally and always asks permission before visiting our home, the result of the firm boundaries David and I established after that night when everything finally came to light and our marriage almost didn't survive the reckoning that followed. The aftermath wasn't easy because David had to confront 2 years of willful blindness and his own role in enabling his mother's abuse, leading to months of couples therapy where we learned to communicate honestly about family dynamics and his deep-seated fear of disappointing his mother that had made him sacrifice his wife's well-being for his own comfort. Linda underwent her own therapy after the family essentially staged an intervention, with David's father threatening divorce and her other children limiting contact until she could acknowledge the damage she had caused and demonstrate genuine change in her behavior towards me and my future family members. The group chat was permanently dissolved, and several family members who had participated in the cruelest messages have maintained their distance from family gatherings, unable to face the shame of their documented cruelty being exposed to their own children and spouses who now see them differently. I learned that self-advocacy isn't selfish or dramatic, that documenting abuse isn't paranoid but practical, and that sometimes the only way to stop a pattern of mistreatment is to make it impossible for people to pretend it isn't happening by forcing them to confront the evidence of their own behavior. David now notices when I'm being excluded or dismissed, speaks up immediately when anyone treats me disrespectfully, and has learned that protecting his wife doesn't mean betraying his family, but rather insisting that his family treat his wife with the same respect they demand for themselves. The transformation in family dynamics has been remarkable, with several members privately thanking me for exposing behavior that had made them uncomfortable but they hadn't known how to address, and even Linda's relationship with her grandchild has improved now that she's forced to interact with me respectfully rather than trying to undermine my parenting at every opportunity. I'm no longer the quiet, doubting woman who sat at that dinner table with an empty plate, wondering if she was imagining the cruelty around her, but instead someone who understands that standing up for yourself isn't about being confrontational or vindictive. It's about refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth and demanding the respect that every human being deserves. The most important lesson I learned is that people can only treat you as badly as you allow them to, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to stop enabling toxic behavior by documenting it, exposing it, and refusing to pretend it's normal or acceptable, because real love doesn't require you to sacrifice your dignity or endure the systematic humiliation in silence.